Can you believe that an empire, one that had stood defiant for 11 centuries, the very bedrock of Western civilization, and the undisputed master of the world, could vanish in a single terrifying night? A catastrophe no one saw coming, yet one that changed the maps, the religions, and the very trajectory of human history forever. This is the story of Constantinople, the second Rome, the impregnable city that was supposed to last until the end of time itself. For 1,123 years, its triple walls, vast, terrifying, and rumored to be blessed by God, had stood against every barbarian, every horde, every jealous king who dared to try and claim its treasures. It was more than a city. It was the entire world's library, its treasury, and its final, glowing beacon of antiquity, tucked safely away on the edge of Europe. But by the year 1453, the mighty Roman Empire was nothing more than a ghost, a shimmering memory clinging desperately to a tiny scrap of land. The empire that once ruled the Mediterranean now consisted of one city, surrounded on all sides by the terrifying, rapidly expanding might of the Ottoman Sultanate. The final, desperate act of the Roman drama was about to begin. Forget everything you know about traditional warfare. Mehmed II was a technological psychopath, a man who understood that history was about to be rewritten not by swords and shields, but by fire and impossible engineering. He wasn't just bringing an army, he was bringing an extinction-level event, a weapon so monstrous that the defenders inside the city walls called it the Devil's Hand. That weapon was the basilisk, the largest cannon the world had ever seen. A bronze behemoth capable of launching a stone ball weighing nearly 1,500 pounds. Its deafening roar was the sound of the Middle Ages collapsing, the unmistakable chime of a new, horrifying era of warfare. This was the first time in history that stone walls, the ultimate symbol of permanent power, became totally obsolete. Imagine the sheer, gut-wrenching terror within the city walls as spring approached. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, a man of fierce yet dwindling faith, knew he was facing a force of 100,000 professional, bloodthirsty soldiers. His own forces? Maybe 7,000 men, a desperate mix of Venetian mercenaries, Genoese volunteers, and exhausted citizens, most of whom had long since lost hope. The stage was set for a siege unlike any other. On one side, 1,100 years of legacy, pride, and supposedly indestructible defenses. On the other, the relentless, cold genius of a young sultan armed with the future of destruction. And the stakes? Nothing less than the complete erasure of one civilization and the violent birth of another. We have to understand the city itself to grasp the depth of the tragedy. Constantinople was defended by the Theodosian walls, a massive defensive system that had absorbed the shocks of history for over a millennium. 3 layers of stone, a moat 60 feet wide, and towers that scraped the clouds. It was a physical manifestation of human resilience. If these walls could fall, what hope was left for any kingdom?
The story of the city's decline is just as critical as its final battle. It wasn't just Mehmed who brought them low. It was centuries of internal rot, civil wars, and the ultimate historical betrayal, the Fourth Crusade. 400 years before Mehmed even arrived, so-called Christian allies had already sacked the city, stealing its treasures and weakening its foundations beyond repair. The city was dying of a chronic illness long before the final acute infection arrived.
But Mehmed was the cure for its suffering, a final, swift death delivered with meticulous precision. He didn't just plan a siege, he orchestrated a masterpiece of logistics and terror. He had to conquer not just the land walls, but the sea as well, controlling the vital waterway known as the Golden Horn. To stop his navy, the desperate Romans stretched a massive iron chain across the harbor entrance, a seemingly unbreakable barrier.
Mehmed's response was pure, unbelievable genius, a move so audacious it defied all known military logic. If he couldn't sail into the Golden Horn, he would simply move his ships over the land, dragging an entire fleet across miles of hills and brush, using oiled logs and teams of oxen, bypassing the chain completely. The defenders woke up one morning to find an entire enemy navy floating in their protected harbor, seemingly materialized from thin air.
This wasn't just warfare. This was psychological torment. The defenders, already exhausted and running low on food, felt the hand of fate closing around their throats. They knew they were fighting not just an army, but a force that seemed capable of performing miracles and defying the laws of nature and physics. The prophecies of doom were suddenly ringing, terrifyingly true.
Every day brought a new, deafening, catastrophic shockwave as the basilic pounded the ancient stones into dust. Every night, the exhausted defenders rushed out under the cover of darkness to repair the massive breaches, knowing that the smallest fissure could mean the end of everything they held sacred. They were fighting for the memory of Rome, for the soul of Christianity, and for their very lives.
The stage is set, the massive cannons are loaded, and the final, agonizing countdown has begun. This is the moment where 1,100 years of history prepares to meet the terrifying force of a single bronze invention. This is the story of the fall of Constantinople, the night the Middle Ages died, and the dawn of a new, perilous world. The Emperor Theodosius II, in the 5th century, had built these land walls, and they were not merely stone and mortar. They were a geological feature, a man-made mountain range stretching 4 massive miles across the western approach. For 1,000 years, they had never been breached by a direct assault. But the true terror was the inner wall, the Mega Tychos, rising 60 massive feet toward the heavens, studded with 96 colossal towers, each a self-contained fortress, spaced 70 yards apart. To attack this city was not a military exercise. It was an act of suicidal faith, reserved for madmen or divinely inspired conquerors. Yet, gazing upon this ancient, unbreakable majesty now, stood the man who intended to prove history and divinity wrong, Sultan Mehmed II. At just 21 years old, Mehmed was a frightening aberration of a leader, a true Renaissance tyrant, born a generation too early. Where previous sultans sought wealth and stability, Mehmed sought immortality through the absolute destruction of this historical pivot. He spoke 6 languages, where previous sultans sought wealth and stability, Mehmed sought immortality through the absolute destruction of this historical pivot. He spoke 6 languages, devoured the histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, not for inspiration, but for challenge. He saw Constantinople not as a city, but as a fatal flaw in the map of his glorious destiny. He had inherited a vast, sprawling empire, yet his eye was fixed solely on this glittering prize, the red apple, held firmly in the hands of the dying Roman state. His predecessors had failed, bound by traditional siege warfare, but Mehmed understood the true nature of the coming age. It was not about tradition, but about technological superiority and relentless, cold calculation. Constantine, facing an empty treasury, a collapsing state, and a populace starving for basic grain, could offer the engineer little more than polite dismissals and copper scraps. Urban, insulted, enraged, and realizing the full scope of his creation, walked straight into the enemy's camp, bringing with him the blueprints for the apocalypse. Mehmed did not offer scraps. He offered a fortune and total, absolute control. The result was the basilica, the king's cannon, a monstrous piece of ordnance that would single-handedly redefine the geometry of war. It was 27 feet long, weighed a staggering 20 tons, and required an infrastructure crisis just to be moved. 70 oxen, hundreds of men, and a team of engineers working around the clock were needed just to drag its massive bronze form across the rocky terrain from Edirne to the walls of the city, a journey that was itself an epic saga of logistical terror. The construction process was an earth-shattering event of fire and labor, designed to fire stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. These projectiles were the size of small flour barrels, moving with such destructive force that no known fortification could withstand their impact for long. When the basilica was finally wheeled into position, aimed squarely at the legendary Theodosian walls, the sheer, impossible scale of the threat silenced every Roman sentinel on the ramparts. This wasn't just a siege, it was an execution scheduled by a machine. His frantic, desperate appeals to the Catholic West for help had been met with cold shoulders, theological pettiness, and cynical, empty promises. The Western powers demanded complete submission of the Orthodox Church in exchange for aid, a price Constantine was willing to pay for survival, but one that infuriated his own rigid clergy and the vast majority of his populace.
"Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," cried the purists in the streets, perfectly willing to risk total annihilation rather than compromise 600 years of religious doctrine and pride. This bitter internal division was perhaps the most fatal, insidious weakness of the supposedly God-protected city.
He was immediately given command of the critical sector, the Lycus Valley, the lowest point of the walls, the place where the ground was flatter and the triple defenses were slightly less dense. It was the natural, inevitable target for the monstrous cannon, and Giustiniani knew he would be facing the heaviest, most brutal assault in history, likely becoming the hinge upon which the fate of the world would turn. As the colossal basilica settled into its massive earthen cradle, Mehmed was simultaneously executing the naval phase of his comprehensive plan. The harbor of the Golden Horn, the city's northern lifeline and its supply route, was protected by a gargantuan iron chain stretched across the mouth of the waterway, making naval assault impossible by tradition. But Mehmed's navy, consisting of over 120 ships, was far too large to simply wait idly. The pressure was mounting. The logistics of feeding and supplying 80,000 men were immense, and Mehmed knew he had to strike fast and with overwhelming brutality before disease, mutiny, or the distant, lingering threat of Western relief could materialize. The trap was set. The great siege was about to commence, pitting the exhausted, defiant spirit of Rome against the terrifying, cold calculation of the gunpowder age. A battle for the soul of the world. On April 6th, 1453, the sun didn't just rise over the Bosphorus, it was swallowed by a tidal wave of blood-red banners. Sultan Mehmed II had arrived. The defenders, maybe 7,000 souls strong, a heartbreaking number to hold a 7-mile perimeter, stood paralyzed atop the legendary Theodosian walls, the triple line of fortification that had defined global invincibility for a millennium. They looked east and saw not an army, but a horror show, a human ocean stretching back to the horizon, a sea of steel and ambition. This was not medieval raiding. This was industrialized war, a cold, calculated machine of destruction. The air grew thick with the dust of marching feet and the terrifying low drone of war drums, a beat that sounded like the steady hammering of coffin nails across the entire plain. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, stood on the parapet, his face grim, knowing that he commanded a dying empire's final, desperate breath against a storm that no mortal power could withstand. His greatest fear materialized when the Ottomans began deploying the heavy artillery. The famous super cannon, cast by the renegade Hungarian master Urban, was slowly dragged into position opposite the St. Romanus Gate, the very weak spot that had haunted the emperor's nightmares for months. It was a terrifying, almost mythical beast of bronze, requiring 60 oxen and hundreds of men just to move, and it was loaded with a stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds, a caliber never before seen in siege warfare. Then the silence broke, not with a charge, but with a sound that tore the very fabric of reality. The gunners lit the slow match, and the explosion wasn't just loud, it was tectonic, a rupture in the earth that sent vibrations through the city's ancient stone foundation, followed by a sickening, high-pitched whistle as the colossal stone projectile shot across the distance. The world held its breath when that 1,200-pound ball slammed into the mighty outer wall. It didn't bounce. It didn't chip. It pulverized. Stone that had defied Attila the Hun and the Avars simply disintegrated into a cloud of screaming shrapnel and dust, leaving a crater the size of a carriage, a wound bleeding light into the darkness of the Roman defense.
The initial shock was almost more devastating than the physical damage. This cannon, nicknamed the Basilic, proved that 1,100 years of divinely sanctioned protection was meaningless against the terrifying cold calculation of gunpowder physics. The strategy was brutally simple. Bombard the same small section of the wall relentlessly, 2 or 3 times a day, slowly grinding the triple barrier down into rubble. Mehmed understood that it wasn't the size of the hole that mattered initially, but the relentless, psychological certainty of destruction. Every morning, the Romans woke up knowing that their walls were smaller, their time shorter, the siege clock ticking faster than their ability to repair the damage.
The defenders, led by the brilliant Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, immediately realized they were fighting a battle against time, powder, and physics. Giustiniani was a giant of a man, a professional warrior whose spirit was unbreakable. But even his genius could not invent a defense against this level of pure, concentrated kinetic energy. They worked the night shift, scrambling like moles under the moon, filling the fresh craters with anything they could find: wooden barrels packed tight with earth, stones from ruined buildings, and hastily constructed timber palisades. It was a desperate ballet, patching immortal wounds with mortal bandages, only to see them ripped open again when the midday sun signaled the cannon's next terrible, earth-shaking roar. While the land wall suffered this agonizing daily attrition, the sea defenses remained stubbornly impenetrable. The city's lifeline, the vast harbor of the Golden Horn, was secured by the legendary Great Chain, a monstrous iron barrier stretching from the Acropolis side across the inlet to the Genoese colony of Galata. This chain was the city's breath, allowing supply ships to slip in and out, offering a sliver of hope and a trickle of much-needed resources. Mehmed's initial attempt to breach the chain with his massive fleet was a humiliating, bloody disaster. The Ottoman navy, though vast, was no match for the superior seamanship of the experienced Genoese and Honshu captains, who knew every current and eddy of the water. The initial naval skirmishes resulted in the fiery destruction of several Ottoman ships, a victory so profound that it briefly lifted the entire city's morale, fueling wild, impossible rumors of divine intervention protecting the harbor. Mehmed, watching this defeat from his command tent, was reportedly incandescent with rage, his young face contorted by the humiliation of being checked by a simple chain and a handful of foreign warships. He was a man obsessed with total control, and this naval stalemate was an affront to his calculated perfection. If the siege dragged on, his massive army could grow restless, supplies would dwindle, and the great powers of Europe might finally overcome their inertia and send a relief force. He needed to neutralize the chain immediately, or the siege would fail before the walls fully crumbled. Mehmed retreated to his massive tent, not to lick his wounds, but to calculate the impossible. If the sea was blocked, he would bypass the sea itself. He immediately tasked his military engineers and thousands of laborers with the most audacious plan ever conceived in naval warfare: to drag the entire fleet, over 70 warships, overland from the Bosphorus, around the neutral but watchful Genoese colony of Galata, and into the protected waters of the Golden Horn. This was lunacy. It defied physics, engineering, and common sense. It meant traversing miles of steep, hilly, forested terrain, requiring a monumental logistical effort in the middle of a siege. Yet, Mehmed was not constrained by common sense. He was driven by destiny and the cold logic of necessity. He ordered his carpenters to immediately construct a vast, greased road of wooden planks, oiled meticulously with animal fat, and engineered to support the colossal weight of his heavy warships. Under the cover of darkness and a spectacular effort of sheer manpower, the impossible project began, a feat that would later be hailed as one of the greatest military maneuvers in history. While the Romans huddled on the Theodosian walls, terrified by the rhythmic destruction of the cannon fire, and comforted only by the seemingly secure harbor, Mehmed was quietly preparing the ultimate checkmate, a move so unexpected and shocking that it would immediately sever the city's heart and lead them directly to the ultimate darkness. The siege was no longer a slow grind. It was about to become an impossible magic trick, one with lethal consequences for the defenders. The impossible magic trick was about to begin. Scripted by iron and gunpowder, orchestrated by the Sultan, who had no patience for history. On the 6th of April, 1453, a date that should be etched in obsidian, the silence over the Golden Horn and the Theodosian walls was shattered by a noise that the Romans had never conceived, a sound that was less an explosion and more the tearing of the fabric of time itself. It was the deafening roar of the great bombard, Urban's masterpiece of death, spitting out projectiles that weighed the equivalent of an armored man, screaming through the air toward the 1,000-year-old bastions. These weren't the clumsy stones of medieval siegecraft. These were monstrous, 1,200-pound granite spheres designed to obliterate permanence. When the first shot struck the outer rampart near the critical valley of the Lycus River, the dreaded Mesotikion, the world didn't just shake, it imploded. Dust, stone, and the pulverized remains of history erupted into the sky, a toxic mushroom cloud signaling the death of the Byzantine era. The defenders, hardened veterans who had faced countless sieges, stood frozen, their mouths agape, realizing instantly that every single defense they had relied upon for a millennium was now obsolete, rendered useless by a single weapon of pure terror. Imagine the sheer, raw panic as a portion of the Triple Wall, the legendary bulwark of Christendom, simply disintegrated. It wasn't chipped, it was vaporized. The great cannon roared maybe 7 times a day. The process of cooling, cleaning, and reloading was excruciatingly slow. But 7 times a day was 7 too many. Every single shot landed with devastating, targeted accuracy, ripping open wounds in the seemingly eternal stone. Emperor Constantine XI, standing atop the mangled battlements, felt the shockwave in his bones, yet his resolve did not crumble. He knew the land siege was lost the moment that first sphere flew, but the sea was still his. He placed his faith in the colossal iron chain, anchored between the Acropolis Point and Galata, a truly staggering feat of engineering designed to turn the Golden Horn into a private Roman lake, impassable to the enemy fleet. This chain, thick as a man's torso and supported by massive floating logs, was the city's breath, its supply line, and its ultimate naval shield. As long as the chain held, relief could arrive, and Mehmed's massive fleet was just an expensive decoration. Mehmed II, however, had not forgotten the sea. He possessed a fleet of over 140 ships, galleys, triremes, and smaller transports, a staggering armada that dwarfed the 26 ships the Romans and their Genoese Venetian allies could muster. The Sultan, driven by his obsessive need for total victory, ordered his admiral, Baltaoglu, to test the chain on April 12th. Baltaoglu was instructed to breach the boom or die trying. But the geography was brutal, forcing the Ottoman ships into a narrow, constrained approach that negated their numerical advantage. The small, elite core of the Roman defense, bolstered by the most savage mercenaries from Venice and Genoa, were waiting. Their ships, though few, were expertly crewed and positioned perfectly behind the massive boom, ready to deliver hellacious retribution upon the invaders. What followed was a tight, brutal dance of fire and steel. The Christians, fighting with the absolute desperation of men defending their last bastion, used Greek fire, that legendary, terrifying weapon that burned even on water, to devastating effect. It was the ultimate medieval chemical weapon, a secret formula that the Romans had guarded for centuries, erupting in green and yellow plumes that clung to the Ottoman decks, consuming wood and flesh indiscriminately. Baltaolu's advance collapsed into chaos, his ships tangled and scorched by the relentless, unquenchable inferno. The outcome was a stunning, short-lived victory for the defenders. Baltaoglu was humiliated, his fleet routed, and the chain remained unbroken, soaring Roman morale, if only for an afternoon. It was the only good news Constantine XI would receive during the entire siege. Because while the sea defenses held firm, the land defenses were undergoing systematic, biblical destruction. Mehmed was not aiming randomly. His gunners were meticulously focusing their fire on the weakest point of the Theodosian wall system, the vulnerable stretch around the St. Romanus Gate, where the ground dipped and the fortifications were marginally less thick. They were performing miracles of emergency repair, scrambling to fill gaps the size of small houses while the ground still trembled from the impacts, trying to turn the debris back into a formidable barrier. Every night they rebuilt what Mehmed's genius had destroyed that day, a Sisyphean struggle waged in darkness and fear. The walls were cracking, but the spirit of the few thousand fighting men was somehow, impossibly, holding fast. They knew that when the cannon stopped, the inevitable infantry assault would follow, and they prepared themselves for the ultimate sacrifice. The Sultan, seeing his cannon success but his naval failure, was already plotting his next move, a move so daring, so audacious, that it would transcend military strategy and enter the realm of historical mythology. He needed to neutralize the chain, and since his mighty ships couldn't break it, he decided they would have to completely bypass the water and the chain itself. Mehmed was about to defy geography, gravity, and the very concept of naval warfare. He was going to move his entire fleet, 70 warships strong, overland, dragging them across 7 miles of solid ground, over the highest hill in Galata, and deposit them directly into the Golden Horn, behind the mighty chain. The morning of April 22nd dawned not with the usual thunder of cannon, but with a paralyzing, unnatural silence that swallowed the last prayers of the desperate Romans. As the first light touched the water, the defenders along the inner harbor walls, the weakest defenses of the entire city, looked out, not at the expected empty expanse, but at a horrifying impossibility. The enemy fleet was sailing toward them. The sheer psychological impact of this maneuver was greater than 1,000 cannon shots. It was the ultimate, mocking betrayal of geography. Mehmed had used incredible quantities of grease, rollers, and human muscle to drag those monstrous ships 7 miles over land, over the highest hill in Galata, into the harbor. Constantine XI, when he received the news, felt the cold terror that only total strategic checkmate can induce. His greatest fear had come to pass. The 7,000 defenders were now forced to stretch their already skeletal ranks, diverting precious reserves from the critical Theodosian land walls to defend the vulnerable sea walls facing the Golden Horn.
This division was exactly what Mehmed had intended. He wasn't just attacking a city. He was attacking the mathematical equation of its defense, ensuring that weakness multiplied weakness until the entire structure collapsed. The Roman emperor knew they had to act immediately to undo this catastrophe, or the entire city would become a vast, indefensible waterfront. A desperate plan was hatched, a counterattack under the cover of darkness. The remaining Venetian and Genoese ships, led by the brave Giacomo Cocco, would attempt a daring fire ship raid. They would slip into the crowded harbor and ignite the newly arrived Ottoman fleet, turning Mehmed's impossible victory into a fiery tomb. The night of April 28th was chosen, but Mehmed, whose spies were everywhere, was already 2 steps ahead of his weary opponents. He had not just dropped his ships into the water, he had already secured them with heavy shore batteries and floating defenses. The moment the Roman ships approached, the Ottomans were ready. The resulting battle was short, brutal, and disastrous for the defenders. Cocco's ship was hit almost instantly by focused cannon fire, shattering the hull and sending him and his crew into the dark waters. The fire ships, meant to be instruments of salvation, were either sunk or driven back in a humiliating retreat. The loss was catastrophic, not just in ships and men, but in morale. It proved that Mehmed now controlled the sea and the internal harbor. There was no escape and no strategic countermove left. The noose was tightening.
Meanwhile, the relentless, apocalyptic drumbeat of the cannonade against the Theodosian walls continued without respite. Urbis's supercannon, the monstrous basilica, was proving to be everything Mehmed had dreamed of. Its massive stone projectiles, weighing nearly half a ton, were not merely damaging the walls, they were systematically pulverizing the very foundations of the Roman defense. Day after day, the section near the St. Romanus Gate, already a known weak point, was reduced to rubble. The air was thick with dust and the stench of sulfur and pulverized lime. The defenders faced not just death, but the psychological torture of listening to 1,100 years of history being methodically smashed into dust.
During the day, the air was filled with Turkish shouts and the horrific impact of the stone balls. At night, the exhausted Romans would scramble into the breaches. This was the true, silent heroism of the siege, the desperate, nocturnal labor of rebuilding. They used anything they could find. Old barrels filled with dirt, chunks of wood, rubble from the shattered wall, even religious icons and tapestries to form a makeshift palisade, a temporary curtain wall designed to absorb the next day's inevitable onslaught. They knew that every time they plugged a gap, they were only buying a few more hours of life. The defensive line was not a stone structure anymore. It was a line of human flesh and sheer, unyielding will, fighting a losing battle against the immutable laws of physics and gunpowder technology. Mehmed, observing this exhausting cycle of destruction and desperate repair, was utterly cold in his calculations. He recognized the incredible tenacity of the Roman defense, but he also saw the mathematical reality. The city could not possibly sustain this rate of damage. The food was dwindling, the gunpowder was running out, and the hope of Western aid had evaporated into the Aegean mist. The Sultan began to prepare for the final push. He ordered his engineers to dig tunnels beneath the walls, attempting to bypass the stone defense entirely. This new threat plunged the already strained defenders into a terrifying subterranean war, forcing them to fight in dark, claustrophobic shafts, listening for the faint sounds of Ottoman picks beneath their feet. The Romans, aided by the brilliant Scottish engineer John Grant, countered these mining efforts with equal ferocity, using countermines and Greek fire to collapse the Ottoman tunnels, turning the cramped passageways into suffocating infernos and burial chambers. The grinding horror of the siege had now crystallized into a single agonizing reality for the defenders. The walls could be broken. It was no longer a theoretical threat whispered by fearful priests, but a visible, terrifying truth, written in mountains of rubble and the smoking craters that scarred the ancient earth. The rhythmic, thunderous pulse of the great bombard was now the city's second heartbeat, a relentless metronome counting down to oblivion. The defenders, fewer than 7,000 against an army of 80,000, were now fighting in shifts that merged into one unending, agonizing blur. Sleep was a luxury only the dead could afford, and food was rationed down to survival scraps, forcing men to live on adrenaline, fear, and the sheer defiant memory of Rome.
Every impact of the stone shot, weighing half a ton, not only shattered the granite, but also shattered morale, reducing one's proud battlements to shifting piles of dust that swallowed men whole. This was not war. This was geological destruction, wielded by a teenage sultan determined to erase a millennium of history.
Sultan Mehmed II, watching from his gilded tent, understood that the walls were not the only defense that needed to be breached. The human spirit itself had to be pulverized before he could walk into the city of the world's desire. To accomplish this psychological annihilation, he ordered a terrifying intensification of efforts far below the earth. He launched massive, coordinated sapping operations, tunnels dug by specialized Serbian miners, designed to undermine the deep foundations of the Theodosian walls and bring down whole sections in sudden, catastrophic collapse. This subterranean shadow war was perhaps the most horrific aspect of the siege. The defenders would suddenly hear the muffled, chilling scrape of picks beneath their feet, knowing that a hidden death squad was working tirelessly to open the gates of Hades directly beneath them. The Romans, however, had a brilliant, unexpected countermeasure in the form of Johannes. The Romans, however, had a brilliant, unexpected countermeasure in the form of Johannes Grant, the Scottish engineering mercenary, a true master of ancient explosives and countermining tactics. Grant and his teams fought the Ottomans in pitch-black, suffocating tunnels. They used listening posts, simple copper bowls placed on the ground, to pinpoint the enemy's digging, then swiftly dug counter-tunnels to intercept. The ensuing battles were fought by torchlight, hand to hand, where the weapons were often just shovels, and the greatest danger was being entombed alive or choked by smoke and sulfur. Grant's tactical genius often saved the city during these weeks. He employed massive bellows to pump noxious fumes into the Ottoman tunnels, and famously used barrels of the dreaded Greek fire, turning the subterranean passages into blazing, unescapable crematoria. These desperate, bloody victories below ground bought the defenders precious time. Yet, above ground, the physical walls continued to crumble under the sheer, brutal weight of the cannonade. The weakest point, the low ground of the Lycus Valley, was now a scene of utter devastation. The outer wall, the Protechisma, which had weathered 1,000 years of storms and sieges, was finally reduced to a long, jagged line of rubble. The 20-foot wide moat was no longer an obstacle, but a dangerous terrain of pulverized stone and broken bodies. Mehmed, seeing the outer defenses compromised, initiated the next phase of psychological torment, continuous, probing attacks using his irregular shock troops, the Bashi bazooks. These were lightly armed fanatics, thrown against the breach in suicidal waves. Their goal was not to capture the city, but to exhaust the precious, irreplaceable reserves of the few professional Roman and Italian soldiers, forcing Emperor Constantine XI to waste his best troops on constant skirmishes. It was attrition, calculated on the grandest, most merciless scale. For every 10 irregulars Mehmed lost, he forced the Roman emperor to commit one of his priceless Genoese archers or Venetian heavy infantry. Constantine XI, abandoning the theoretical command post, spent his days and freezing nights in the heart of the battle, specifically at the Great Breach in the Lycus Valley. His imperial purple was constantly caked in dust and the blood of his men. He was forced to oversee the construction of the Xylo Portia, a desperate, terrifyingly flimsy palisade of wood and earth erected behind the ruins of the outer wall, standing as the final, pitiful barrier against the entire might of the Ottoman Empire. This simple wooden fence was all that now defended the heart of the Roman world. Across the Golden Horn, the vast Ottoman fleet, which had been mysteriously active, was now preparing for something far more sinister than a simple naval skirmish. Though the great chain still held the harbor, the pressure was tightening like a garrote.
Mehmed was not content merely to pound the land walls. He was preparing a simultaneous assault from the sea, threatening to bypass the main defenses entirely and force the defenders to stretch their meager forces even thinner along the massive, vulnerable sea walls.
The city was completely surrounded, besieged not just by land and sea, but by the overwhelming, suffocating sense of abandonment. No help was coming. The exhaustion was absolute. The youthful sultan was now ready to move from the slow terror of bombardment to the full, screaming horror of the final assault. And the Romans knew their time was measured in mere days.
The guns had fallen silent, but the quiet was 1,000 times more terrifying than the cacophony of the great bombard. Mehmed II, the young conqueror, was not resting. He was coiling the snake. After 6 weeks of tearing the Theodosian walls to ribbons, he had achieved the impossible. The city's legendary shield was shattered, and now the reckoning was coming. A judgment delivered by 80,000 screaming souls. The immense Ottoman camp, sprawling further than the eye could see, began to stir with an organized, chilling energy that spelled the absolute end for the Romans inside. They knew the bombardment was merely the overture. The true opera of slaughter was about to begin, and it would be sung in blood.
Inside Constantinople, the defenders looked out across the scarred landscape, not seeing men, but seeing a tidal wave of sharpened steel and unrelenting zealotry. Every single man on the walls, Genoese, Venetian, and Roman, knew that the next time the sun rose, they would be fighting for their final breath. Emperor Constantine XI, a man worn down to the bone by weeks of sleepless vigilance and mounting despair, called his last desperate war council. The discussion was not about strategy anymore. It was about honor. Their numbers were catastrophically low, perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 effective fighters against Mehmed's behemoth army. There would be no relief force coming. The West had failed them entirely.
The great church of Hagia Sophia, which had served as the spiritual heart of the world for a millennium, now held a silence heavy with impending doom. The emperor ordered a final, solemn procession. Icons that had protected the city for centuries were paraded through the muddy, ruined streets, a last tearful prayer for a divine intervention that history strongly suggested would never arrive. It was the night the Middle Ages prepared its own tomb. Across the valley, in the Sultan's magnificent tent, the atmosphere was one of calculated, ruthless anticipation. Not everyone, however, shared Mehmed's thirst for total annihilation. Halil Pasha, the aging Grand Vizier, a relic of an older, more cautious diplomacy, pleaded one last time for prudence. "My lord, the cost will be too great. The city is yours to take, but the risk to the army, the shame if we fail, is unbearable. Let us offer terms." Halil Pasha, fearing the reputation of the Ghazi Sultan would be stained by the sheer butcher's bill, advocated for a negotiated surrender. But Mehmed, the 21-year-old engine of history, fixed him with a stare that promised both absolute power and imminent death.
Terms? Mehmed's voice was reportedly low, lethal, and utterly dismissive. "My forefathers fought for this city for centuries. It belongs to the Prophet, and it belongs to me. This is not about terms, Vizier. This is about destiny. And the world will remember the name of the man who closed the gates of Rome forever." He swiftly dismissed the old man, sending a chilling message to every commander present. Hesitation meant decapitation. Mehmed then issued the final, irreversible command. The assault would begin at dawn. The prize? The entirety of the city's wealth and women. 3 full days of unimaginable plunder for the soldiers who took it. This promise fueled a frenzy of avarice that made the Ottoman army an unstoppable force of human desire.
Once the Bashi bazooks were annihilated or exhausted, the second wave would crash forward, the organized Anatolian regiments. These troops were disciplined, focused, and specifically tasked with concentrating their attack on the massive breach near the St. Romanus Gate, where the Roman defenses were now little more than makeshift palisades of barrels and dirt. These men would utilize coordinated maneuvers and attempt to secure a permanent foothold, grinding the already fatigued defenders into the dust. The pressure was designed to be absolute, a constant, crushing weight that offered no quarter.
The entire night of May 28th was spent in a horrific silence, broken only by the sound of preparation. In the Ottoman camp, drums beat incessantly, not in a battle rhythm, but in a psychological thunder that echoed across the valley, keeping the Romans awake, reminding them of the unholy numbers waiting outside. Fires burned everywhere, illuminating thousands upon thousands of tents, creating a vision of hellish anticipation. The defenders, watching from the shattered ramparts, saw not just an army, but a force of nature, an inevitable storm that could no longer be weathered. The wall was now less a fortress and more a brittle skeleton, constantly threatening to collapse into a grave for the defenders desperately trying to fill the crater left by the previous day's cannonade. Every sunset brought a moment of terrifying temporary relief, allowing the exhausted Roman and Venetian engineers, guided by the genius of Giovanni Giustiniani, to pour every scrap of stone and timber into the gaping wounds. But the daylight, the terrifying, agonizing daylight, brought the monstrous cannon back to life.
Mehmed was not just bombarding stone, he was attacking the very concept of Roman permanence. He had perfected the rhythm of destruction, 100 shots a day from the largest piece, followed by continuous smaller fire designed solely to prevent effective repairs. The roar of the great bombard was the city's grim clock, marking the passage of their doom.
Yet, despite the unimaginable pressure, the defenders held. They fought with the desperation of men who knew the price of failure was not just death, but the end of their world, the end of the 1,000-year lineage that stretched back to Augustus himself. Constantine XI moved like a ghost along the crumbling battlements, his face etched with sleepless fatigue, offering prayers and promises, the last living link to an empire that was dying before his eyes.
The quiet horror of the siege began to move underground. Turkish sappers, hardened miners brought in from Serbia, began digging meticulously, silently, like grave robbers coming for the city's soul. Their goal was simple: place charges beneath the massive foundations of the outer wall, collapse them inward, and create a sudden, catastrophic entrance point. But the Romans were not blind to this ancient threat. A brilliant engineer, Johannes Grant, a Scot or German mercenary whose loyalty was bought by coin but secured by the desperate cause, was tasked with countermining. He was a master of sound and vibration, his life now spent crawling in the darkness. Every man on the walls was forced into absolute silence at times, holding their breath, ears pressed to the earth, listening for the faint, rhythmic scraping of picks far below. It was a game of blind terror, where a wrong move meant tons of earth collapsing upon you, or worse, the sudden explosion of enemy steel into your tunnel. Grant's tactics were brutal and terrifyingly effective. When a Turkish tunnel was detected, the Roman countermine would intersect it, not to fight hand-to-hand in the dark, but to unleash the legendary Greek fire, the unquenchable chemical weapon, down the passage, turning the entire underground corridor into an instant crematorium, sealing the sappers in a tomb of screaming, burning pitch. The defenders celebrated these small, subterranean victories, but they were temporary reprieves in a war of attrition they could not possibly win. They were bleeding manpower, while Mehmed's inexhaustible army simply waited, tightening the noose. The great chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn remained Constantinople's steel lifeline, a symbol of defiance that mocked Mehmed's massive navy.